Greetings from Brooklyn, everybody. I'm actually walking to the subway to go and do another interview right now. Really off and moving with the new show. Today is one of my favorite guests from Here We Are, Henry G. If you want to go back and hear any of those other episodes, but Henry is a paleontologist, an evolutionary biologist, and the senior editor of Nature, which, if you don't know, that's like the biggest science journal. Like every scientist's dream to be published in Nature, and Henry's the person that is the one making those kinds of decisions. You know, this is like getting a special or something if you're a comedian, or certainly at the very least getting a late night appearance or something, right? And so, but I'm not a scientist trying to get my papers published in Nature, so the stakes aren't very high for me. And so I think of Henry as kind of just a old pal, I guess, at this point. And even though we don't know each other that well, he's just been incredibly generous, and he's also just so friendly and just so incredibly entertaining. His book, Very Short History of Life on Earth, I hope I'm remembering this, 4.6 billion years in 12 pithy chapters, is one of my favorite books of all time. I'm not good at remembering names and titles, but the book is very memorable. And I talked to him about his new book, The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire. And it's a rather positive conversation where we talk about the many, just how many challenges the human race has faced in its time here on Earth, and how remarkable it is that we're even alive at all. And so really incredible conversation. This really sets the pace for my interests and what I care about. Even reading his book, I found myself questioning a lot of my own worldviews as well, which is so intriguing and beneficial for my own thinking. So you can pre-order that book today, and right now you can listen to this brand new episode with my very first guest on the show, Henry G. A rather auspicious timing. We get to record now on January 14th, which is my new favorite holiday, which I recently discovered.
What's that holiday?
It's a celebration of the donkeys of the Bible. It lasted for a few hundred years during the Middle Ages, and it was called the Feast of the Ass.
Oh, yeah. I was, it's come a bit too late for me. I was hoping to celebrate the 10,521st annual festival of the execration of Backrug, the great water lizard. It's not many people know.
You're a...
So I would have been going out to have a jolly good execrate today, but you've got me instead.
So Henry, I'm just going to, we might insert some of the stuff from our interview before we got cut off, but I had made the point that one of the most profound things about reading your new book, which is available for pre-order, what is it? The Fall and Decline
The decline and fall of the human empire.
That's what it is. The
Why
decline and
our
fall.
why our species is on the edge of extinction. It's being
Right. And
it's being so cheerful that keeps me going, basically.
yeah, yeah. Well, exactly right. So you would think if I were reading a book about the mass extinction of the human race, that I would be this would be a stressful ordeal. But I actually found it to be a much more calming, enjoyable experience than flipping on the television at any moment during any day ever.
Hmm. Well, yes, I like to take a kind of long view of things, being a paleontologist. And in my last book, A Very Short History of Sex and Chocolate, I looked at 4.5 billion years of Earth's history, actually, and I threw in another billion for free near the end. So when you do that and you look at all the extinctions and the lava and the volcanic eruptions and everything and all the fuss and brouhaha of all that, you tend to. I mean, somebody asked me why I wasn't terrified by all this, just getting up in the
Right.
morning, and I said, well, actually, the result was I've cultivated a what I call a philosophic repose. All these things are just motes in the eye of Brahma, and I could be living in LA, or starving to
Yeah.
death in Africa, or in the middle of a war somewhere. So you just have to keep trucking along. Basically, what else can you do?
Yeah.
Also, I'm British, so I don't like fuss or hysteria. I tend to I tend to look rather askance at people running around screaming and shouting. I think, get a grip, man, stiff upper lip and all that. So
It's
that's
funny
what.
because I do think of the British as there's something about like royalty that you think that comes off as fussy,
Hmm,
but so it's a weird dichotomy to be both fussy and to not like causing a fuss
hmm, hmm,
at the
hmm.
same time. I do. What was the holiday that you said
Yeah,
that
it's
you
the 10,521st annual festival of the execration of Backrug, the great water lizard. I think you'd have to be a fan of H.P. Lovecraft really to get that one.
I don't know the reference, but I love it.
Yeah, it's H.P. Lovecraft was a horror writer of the early 20th century. His work is so appallingly bad; it's brilliant, and he's been a great influence on horror writers ever since. And the wonderful thing about Lovecraft is his work is so appalling that he's very very easy to parody. And a lot of horror writers have actually cut their teeth by writing Lovecraft parodies, or anyway, he was a very strange person. Was Lovecraft? You have to look him up. Not a
I
very
Yeah,
not a very
they made
nice
some.
man, actually. Not a very nice person, probably by today's standards. Um,
They made some series based on some of his stuff, and I watched a little bit, and I'm like, I don't get it. This is awful. And now things are starting to click into place as I'm talking with you.
mm,
Well, you said lizard associations went off in my head, and then I was thinking about the struggles of existence
mm.
that a given you know spin the wheel of life and land on any given species you'd probably find one that's having a bit harder of a time than us right now. And I was thinking of there's a scene in one of these David Attenborough documentaries that consistently comes back to my head of just this baby lizard. I forget what
Yes,
species,
I know the one.
hatching
Yeah, I know the
and
one.
then running through a den of snakes, just like hundreds of snakes having to. This thing has been hatched for less than a minute, and it finds itself running through full-grown adult snakes that are larger than it,
maybe faster than that have been waiting for this moment, that are hungry, and it needs to, not knowing anything in life, just pure instinct, hopefully be lucky enough to, in its first moments of whenever life starts hatching, uh, out out instinct these hundreds of snakes to be able to survive into minute 5 of
I
life.
know, I know. Attenborough does it all the time. It's so stressful. I mean, me and my wife watch these Attenborough documentaries, and he always says, "And here is the baby dongo flip. It's only just hatched, and here it is with its mother on the plains of Outer Rumelia. But no, on the horizon
Yeah.
is a fierce carnivore that is going to come in and bite its head off." And my wife says, "No, Sir David, I can't look. Don't do it to me. Stop doing it to me." And then it says,
Yeah.
"But the little animal dives down a hole and lives to see another day." And my wife says, can I open my eyes now?" So yeah, it's always like this.
It's much about editing, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, oh yeah.
most of that lizard's life is actually pretty laid back.
Mm, mm,
Being cold blooded and get
mm, mm,
not have to eat too much to get
mm,
by,
mm.
and hang out basking in the sun much of the day. That is that's another interesting point when it comes to editing, the kind of drama of a narrative to hook people in.
Mm, mm,
What
mm.
would you say are some key moments from there, where if Edinburgh went back in time and looked at humanity, where it was just shocking that humans were able to have made it
Well,
this far.
actually, for almost any point
Yeah.
in the human career, before about 10 to 20,000 years ago, for the preceding 7 million years of the lives of humans and our relatives, humans and, well, I'm using the word human very broadly to mean any member of the human group of species, Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, all these ones. Most of the time, humans lived in very, very small groups, were very, very thinly spread over the environment, and were always extremely rare. You can find this when you go fossil hunting. I mean, as I've had the pleasure of doing in Kenya, going with Meave Leakey to investigate, to prospect for fossil hominins. There you go on the shores of Lake Turkana, and they're fossils of catfish and alligators and turtles all over the place. You just don't bother with them; they're so common. And then they're fossils of other things like antelopes and pigs and things. These occur fairly often, but you can collect them if you feel like it. But from the whole field season, the fossils of humans are basically tiny fragments of teeth, and they can live in a kind of tobacco tin. That's it. That's the whole
Hmm.
season. And if humans were as common as pigs or antelopes or something, there would be a lot more fossils. But you can tell, and it was the case until recently. Humans have always been extremely rare, and one of the consequences of being rare and living in small groups is that extinction is very, very close. They were always one meal away from starvation, 2 meals away from extinction. And when you live in a small group, extinction can come by any kind of random occurrence. A large boot could come down from space and squash you, or you could be drowned in a flash flood, or in a bushfire or something. In my last book, the aforementioned A Very Short History of Sex and Chocolate, I
Why don't you give people the actual names
It's
so they
called
can check
a
out one of
very.
my favorite books of all
Oh,
time?
thank you. I expect you say that to all the girls. It's a very short history of life on Earth. I said that all happy, thriving species are the same, but each species facing extinction does so in its own way. And I call this the Karenina principle. You're welcome. And so when you get a small group of people.
Wait. What's the reference again?
Well, that's the first line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. It says something like, "All happy families are the same, but all sad families are sad in their own way," or something like that. So
Yeah.
that's that reference. So humans were always rare, and there was a particularly awkward age about a million years ago where there were no more than 1,000 breeding humans at any given moment for 100,000 years. So you can tell this not just from the rarity of the fossils, but from the fact that all humans today, no matter what we look like, all our variation is really literally skin deep. Humans are very, very genetically similar to each other. There is more genetic variation in one group of chimpanzees in a forest in Côte d'Ivoire than in the entire human species. And this shows that humans have been very rare and have gone through a series of bottlenecks where they've become so rare that they've almost become extinct, and the entire new population has been bred from that tiny number that managed to survive.
Making matters worse, the downsides of incest and having the incredibly homogeneous genes and increasing the rates of bad mutations.
Well, this is what happens in small populations because you don't have much of a choice of mate, and you're likely to have a mate that is quite closely related to you. And in fact, this was the norm until Western genetics came along. Close marriage among people was very, very common. And it's still common in many societies today. It's well known to happen in royal families who wanted to keep the royalness in the family. And everyone's heard about the Habsburgs who dominated Europe for 600 years. And the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles II, El Hechizado, the Bewitched, there were so many consanguineous marriages in his ancestry that the poor chap was practically disabled. He had all sorts of problems. He only lived till he was 38, but looked older. He had that Habsburg jaw. That if you look at all the paintings of the Habsburgs, they have this protruding jaw and chin. It meant he couldn't eat properly, and he was always having all sorts of problems. And it was because of the inbreeding. But we only know about that because of his great royalness. But it's common in all people. There have been various studies among families in various societies to show that marriage between first cousins is quite usual. And the most poignant example of this was Charles Darwin, who married his first cousin Emma Wedgwood.
This is
And
when I got to this section of your book, this observation that you made, I don't think it will ever leave me. It's a very interesting thought.
I mean, poor old Charles Darwin. The Darwins and the Wedgwoods had been intermarrying for generations. And so when he realised the principles of heredity, and then he suddenly, well, I don't know how suddenly, 3 out of his 10 children with Emma died in infancy. Now, of course, back in the day, infant mortality was quite common anyway. But these were well-to-do people with nannies and nursemaids, and inbreeding depression might have had something to do with that.
And the idea, the rather dark idea being that Charles Darwin, being one of the few people in all of humanity at that time to stumble on some of these ideas. I mean, there were ideas that led that led to his. That people were picking up on, with agriculture and everything, being able to have heritable traits, but no one quite articulated it
No.
as well as Charles did it, and knew it as well, and for him to have that specific knowledge and then realize that may have been what was responsible for his own
And these
children.
things have consequences, more than
Right.
just for the unfortunate health of the people concerned. I mean, I've talked about Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700, and the result of that, he had 2 marriages but no children. Because I don't know whether he could get it up at all, or whether it was just the consequences of the inbreeding were too horrible. But he died in 1700 without an heir. And this led to a war called the War of the Spanish Succession, which was a world war that lasted for 14 years and killed hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people. And this is a direct result of inbreeding depression. So these things are important.
This is you're essentially the first guest on the new show, so
Ah,
there's people that there's people that listened to Here We Are and the 400 different scientists that I've talked with, but there's also a lot of people kind of getting a fresh start. I wonder if maybe we could break down some. It's kind of a good. Incest is one of those kind of like attention grabbing topics that can actually, I think, help break down some very basic and slightly more nuanced ideas of how evolution works. Because I mean, this is a lot of like rats. If you have rats kind of smelling different pheromones of other rats to see which ones they're most attracted to, they'll tend to stay away from the pheromones of rats that are extremely closely related, but also favor, I think, like second-ish cousin, first-ish cousin, and some of the underlying principles being that kind of in an ideal world, wouldn't it be great if me, Shane, I could just make a clone of myself, 100% of my genes, but I have to make this unfortunate compromise of splitting splitting my genes because some of the benefits are that I'm switching up my immune system and perhaps helping. What's the word for
well, you're just mixing it up. You're making your genes
mixing it up.
more variant to keep one step ahead of disease. This is what happened 2 billion years ago when the first eukaryotic cells evolved, and they had this. Well, bacteria are very kind of casual. They just swap DNA like trading cards, like kids in the playground. But eukaryotes have this very organized quadrille, this kind of Regency dance of things coming together like that. Just watch a movie of a Jane Austen adaptation, and it's called sex. And what it does is it mixes up the genes, so it keeps a variation on the boil. And we're talking about incest. Humans have always lived in very small groups, thinly scattered. But humans, traditionally, like all primates, tend to go in for wife swapping. No, that didn't come out quite as what I meant. What I meant is that the females of a group tend to leave the group and go and live with the group of their mate. The males tend to stay in
I
the
was
same
just
group.
watching a bonobo documentary, and they exhibit the same
So
behavior.
what generally happens, or I like to think happens, is that groups are generally they tend to keep well apart for most of the time, but at certain times of year when they want to come and celebrate the 10,521st festival of the execration of Backrug the great water lizard, or the anniversary of the donkeys in the Bible, or anything you like, they will get together at the sacred mountain or the waterhole, and they will tell stories and get drunk and feast and choose mates. There will be singing and dancing and mate choosing, and then the mates will swap around, and the young women will tend to go to the families and groups of the clan of their male partner, and that you only need a small amount of this to keep the genetic variation on the boil and to stop incest and inbreeding becoming so awful that it leads to instant extinction.
Because
that's what happens.
So I have like 4,000 negative mutations in me. Maybe none of them are dominant genes. They aren't expressed, but they're these recessive traits. And if I go out, I'm in Brooklyn right now, and I go out and I put my sign out that says that I'm open for business or whatever, and the line forms, and I meet with mate with some random female. The chance of her having any of those exact same mutations out of 4,000 out of the how many?
She'll have 4,000 random mutations, but they'll be different from yours. So
exactly.
You're covered.
But if one of them happens to be some sibling no one ever told me about, and they might have the same mutations, and this is why we want to stick away from getting together with our family members.
There is another thing that happens when you have small populations that then expand to become big populations, and that is if one member of that small population has some genetic disability or variant, that the proportion in the population will be hugely expanded in the subsequent population. And in my latest book, which I wanted to call Demure Mindfulness, the Taylor Swift Way, but my publishers they didn't even say no, they just didn't look at my email. I just think it's very rude of them. So they insisted it was called The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire. I give an example of this called the flounder effect. And if you cast your mind back, as I know you will, to 1652, some Dutch colonists, mostly men, were set up at the Cape Colony at the very, very tip of South Africa. And the reason they did that was to have a bit of civilization that would help resupply Dutch ships going round the Cape on their way to India and the East Indies. So they had all these chaps farming away in Dutch in South Africa. And then they realized that this colony wasn't going to get anywhere unless they had some women to go with the farmers. Farmers often need wives. So the Dutch East India Company exported some orphan girls from Holland. They had, we want some volunteers, they said. You and you, right, you're going on a ship to marry some Dutch farmer at the other end of the world. And so they all went off to Holland, from Holland to the east, to the Cape, where they had all these sex-starved Dutch colonists. And they all got together, and there were a couple of them who got together, and they formed a dynasty. There was a problem that one of these two people carried a gene which is actually dominant, not recessive. So even if you have only one copy, the disease will be manifest. And it caused porphyria variegata. It was kind of the same disease that was the madness of King George III. He suffered from porphyria. Although in America the movie was called The Madness of King George, because they thought that cinema goers in the United States would think that if it was called The Madness of King George III, what was this, the second sequel or something? So, but anyway, But I digress. But it was this
I love a
madness that,
digression. You're
yeah, this
fine.
madness led to the creation of the United States. So these things have consequences. Anyway, back to the Afrikaners. One of these two colonists, the farmer and his new wife, had a gene for porphyria, which was very rare in Holland. But because there were only a small number of Afrikaner colonists and their wives, this gene, and they all inbred, this gene was magnified so that Porphyria variegata is actually much more common in Afrikaners, that is, South Africans of Dutch descent, than in the general population. So this is what happens when you get populations shrinking to a small amount and then radiating out. You tend to get this kind of sampling effect. It's why certain populations who are inbred and are small tend to have particular genetic quirks. There are loads of them, and I mention a few
So
in the book.
So someone's deciding to or they're away on vacation and they go to some pet shop and they see a variety of lizards, and there happen to be like this family of purple ones of some species. It's incredibly rare. It's probably bad for their health, but they just so happen to be purple. You go, oh my gosh, I've never seen a purple lizard before. You take them, you bring them back to Florida. They get out and they start breeding, and these purple lizards, even though they're not as healthy as that population that they came from, happen to be the only ones in Florida, and they happen to
Purple,
take off.
purple lizards. Purple
No,
lizards.
I'm like
What
making
are
up a
you?
hypo.
What are you on? Purple lizards.
I'm making up a hypothetical.
Ah, yeah, that's your excuse. Okay, I'll go. I'll run with that. Okay.
Henry does follow my psychedelic
It
adventures
reminds
a
me
little
of when
bit.
I was putting carpet tiles in my office, which is here, and I had this adhesive, and it's a very small space, and I started spreading the adhesive on the floor and putting the carpet tiles. It's only a small space, but by the end, I was accompanied by Harvey, the giant 8-foot pink octopus, and his orchestra. It was great.
Yeah.
I had a dinger of
I,
a headache
I
afterwards.
like that. I was like, you know what? I'm going to simplify this example in a nice, easy, visual way that people will be able to understand. And within 30 seconds, you're like, "Are you insane?
No,
What's
no, I've
happening
just
right
been
now?"
following your comedy. That's all.
I so so
Anyway, let's
this
go
is
back to the lizards that just happen to be purple. Okay.
I just think I think a lesson that is good to keep infusing in people early on, when one wraps their head around how evolution works, is that there often tends to be this pesky illusion of directionality and
Mm,
illusion of like right or wrong or better or worse or something, but
mm.
there's all of these happenstances that happen in this founding principle is a very good example.
Exactly. It's all a crapshoot. The evolution has no direction. It is now has no end in view. It has no memory, and it has no foresight. It just deals with what's there at the time. And when groups of animals, as it may be people or lizards in Florida, it's just these tiny random events actually come to the fore. It's a funny thing that natural selection, Darwin's natural selection, really only works when you have large groups of
Hmm.
creatures, when there are populations. When I was at college learning about genetics, we learned about the spread of mutations through populations, and the model. Everything's done with a toy model, a mathematical model, just to make things simpler. And the model you always start with is something called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It sounds like a kind of disaster movie, with what is this equilibrium of Hardy and Weinberg? But what it means, it is the starting assumption that when boy meets girl, any boy in the population can meet any girl in the population, or vice versa, and the population is infinite in size. Now, of course, that sounds very unrealistic, but basically the idea is to give you a baseline so that when you're tinkering with the population size and you're tinkering with the selectivity between the partners, you get an idea of what's going on. But its natural selection tends to work best in that ideal state when you get very big populations in which anyone can choose anyone else. But what tends to happen, certainly in human history, is completely different from that. You get very small populations in which the effects of random chance wildly outweigh natural selection. It's called random genetic drift. And as you were saying with the purple lizards, somebody finds a mutant purple lizard and it's got this dominant gene for purplehood, and you breed it and they escape from your vivarium, and all of a sudden Florida is full of purple lizards. And it relied on a chance that you've got one or two purple lizards and you've taken them from the purple gene is rare, you take it away from the population and just breed purple lizards, and then you get a lot of purple lizards. This was basically what Darwin was talking about when he started The Origin of Species. He started, his first chapter was called was about how things are selected but artificially. So you got tumbler pigeons and racing pigeons. He was into pigeons, and it was the selector was the farmer, but that stood for natural selection. But when you're talking about small populations, you're not selecting for a trait. You basically have any trait that just happens to be there at the time, whether it's good or bad.
So then we have these kind of black swan sort of blind spots where if 50 years from now you happen to be a Floridian and the only lizard you've ever seen is a purple one, and you just think of lizards as purple, and purple must be the best kind of lizard that there is, and at the start of this thing it was actually the worst, least healthy thing out there, and it just found itself in some favorable environment in this hypothetical drug-fueled thought experiment.
Well, this is quite interesting. It's a kind of fallacy that conservationists fall into. They find some rare population of a purple lizard on some island somewhere, and it's dying out for some reason. Maybe it's being eaten by David Attenborough's snakes. And they take it into the laboratory and try and recreate the conditions that they think purple lizards would like, when in reality the environment in which they were found was the last gasp environment in which they happened to be, and was really not very favourable to its survival, because all the favourable environments have been built over by condos and shopping malls. And so and the conservationists...
That's such a fascinating way to think about
conservationists tend to have this kind of take one slice of life, and quite often what happens is an extremely rare purple lizard that's only found in one tiny island off North Carolina or something. It becomes naturalized in Florida and does really well. So then what do you think? Is the species really endangered? Because it's endangered in that one spot that just happened to be its last refuge, but you've introduced it to Florida and it does really well, but then you consider it as a weed, an invasive species that shouldn't be there. So there is a kind of flip side to conservation that people, conservationists, probably don't like to realise, is that there is probably more biodiversity as a result of human activity than extinction, because what humans do is they move species to other places, and although some species become extinct, others kind of burgeon. So all these introduced species that are introduced everywhere by human beings and then become naturalized, it's all a question of perspective. I mean, when you're walking around the British countryside or driving around the British countryside, there are these stupid birds called pheasants that just run into the middle of the road, and these basically I just refer to jaywalkers as pheasants, because they're reincarnated as pheasants. They're forever doomed to run into the middle of the road. And because we've all grown up with these pheasants, we think that they are natural and normal, but they weren't. They were introduced by the Romans, possibly, as game
Right.
birds. Similarly with rabbits. I mean, what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, there was the pheasants, and the rabbits, and some species that are common now used to be rare. Some species that are rare used to be common. I mean, 5 million years ago in Britain, there were things called tulip trees, which are now exotics, and people have to plant them deliberately in their gardens. So another thing is the ginkgo tree, this famous ancient relic lineage of a tree from the Jurassic period that was only found growing in the imperial gardens of China. And now it just grows everywhere on every street because it turns out they're really tough and they're resilient to traffic fumes and they're really pretty. And so they just grow everywhere. The fact that they just happened to their last refuge just happened to be the imperial gardens of China happened to be just one of these flukes. It wasn't that it was, it just was, it's what you think of as their natural environment. In other words, the environment that you happen to find it in was completely unnatural, and it was probably much happier growing wild on a street corner. So this is the
Yeah,
thing, and it's human beings that mix all this up.
it's an interesting yeah thing to think about just how much because there's a few things going on there's a scarcity bias. There's a what is it, a static or state bias or whatever,
Yeah, I know.
whichever
Yeah,
kind of world that you're born in, you just assume like that's the way it's always
yeah,
been, that's the
yeah,
way it ought to be.
yeah.
And things have always been and will
Hmm,
continue
hmm, hmm.
to
But
change.
the
And
environment is never static; it's always changing. And we've talked about the differences between England and America, and about America being wide open spaces, and England being a small island that has been dug over repeatedly for 1,000 years. Is something we have for conserving the countryside here. I mean, I remember just locally near where I live, there was somebody had planned to put up a wind turbine on their farm, and there was a huge campaign against this, and the reason was it would disturb the countryside. I was the only person who put a letter in favour of this wind turbine because I said, hey, farms are unnatural landscapes. We the
yeah,
landscape of England hasn't been natural for 1,000 years. If you
yeah,
just let it develop, it would grow into a kind of pasture land with trees and grassland with deer and bison and beavers in the rivers. So what you think of as natural is exactly what you've just said. You tend to think that the environment as you find it is what it ought to be and what it's always been.
yeah.
There's another great
It's,
example that's come to light almost recently, and that's much bigger than my little corner of England. In fact, it's quite a wrench from one to the other. It's the Amazon rainforest. We tend to think of the Amazon rainforest as absolutely natural, pristine wilderness. When you come to the Amazon
the
rainforest,
last refuge
yes, exactly.
of nature,
That's
the
right.
last part that humans haven't completely destroyed and
Well,
obliviated, and we must
exactly.
do.
So you look at this Amazon rainforest; it's extremely untidy with these trees all over the place, and there are only a few people, indigenous people, living in it. But actually, a few thousand years ago, it was an intensively farmed and domesticated landscape. People are finding, using archaeology, LiDAR, radar and light detection from drones, that in a lot of places in the Amazon, there are signs of field systems, monumental structures, huge great garden cities full of people. Well, where did the people go? They all died from the flu and smallpox when the conquistadors came. Only the flu and smallpox went ahead. So when the conquistadors, who actually were interested in writing anything down, actually came to the Amazon, they saw it as a wilderness with no one living in it. When actually it had been intensively farmed and groomed and nurtured for thousands of years. And what we see as the Amazon rainforest is basically all this all these farms and ancient lost cities have just been reclaimed by the jungle. It's not primary forest. It's all been disturbed. And there was, in fact, even before laser ranging discovered these big structures, there is a kind of soil you find in the Amazon forest, this kind of black earth, which is known to have been formed by cultivation. So people originally thought it was by very small scale cultivation. You know, people chopped down a few trees and then farmed a few crops just in little patches. But no, it's found that there were whole maize field systems in what is now the Amazon jungle. And so what we think of as the Amazon jungle is absolutely far from it, because we're used to seeing fields with sheep and cows and, you know, fences and things like that. That's what we think of as farming. And you're exactly right. What you see as natural and normal is entirely dictated by your perceptual bias.
So can you help me think through something a little bit? Because I was kind of I was thinking when I was your book about the the difference between, thinking about the more basic ideas of like a quote unquote selfish gene perspective, and this idea of these whichever gene is able to replicate itself best is kind of what we're paying them what's worthy of paying the most attention to. I was thinking about ecology a little bit more, and how if we, well, in celebration of the Feast of the Ass, we'll use
Yeah.
an example of a donkey. So you have some wild ass somewhere way back when that happens across some sort of fruit, eats this fruit, digests these seeds, and donkeys with their incredible endurance, goes walks 40 miles or something like that in some direction, relieves itself and inadvertently plants this seed somewhere with some fertilizer and everything ready to go. This fruit has now just made this 40-mile voyage that it never saw coming and just happened. But I was thinking about how that then is impacting, that has this impact on like generations later. Now this wild ass that has its own kids, and then grandkids and great grandkids are now getting to reap the harvest. It's now getting to have this favorable fruit from some tree that was from a seed that its great grandfather inadvertently planted and expanded its a favorable donkey environment in that direction. Do you think of do people then kind of think of gene interactions as like gene swarms? Like do you know what I'm saying? We're like, if that apple is now kind of dependent, if that gene for that apple is now going along with that donkey gene and is like kind of dependent on it,
Well, you do get these kind of co-evolutionary relationships
right,
that start to happen by chance, but you do get relationships between certain plants and certain pollinators, so that it just happens that the
right.
plant becomes to depend on this one pollinator to pollinate it and spread the plant around, and conversely, this pollinator needs the flowers of this one plant to live on, and then they become very closely associated. But these kind of relationships are tighter or looser as time goes on. But what you've kind of described with the donkey is the beginnings of agriculture.
Yeah.
And I talk about agriculture as simultaneously a good thing for humans and also a bad thing for many reasons. But one of the interesting things is nobody really quite knows how agriculture got going because nobody had in their head, no hunter-gatherer has in their head, ooh, I think I'll be a farmer today. So that didn't happen. So how did it happen? Well, the scenario that I put forward in my book, here is the cover of it, actually. Is the scenario.
Fantastic. But and by the way, I will say that even for like maybe a new listener, we're talking fast and jumping around. We've had a bit. We've had you and I have had conversations in the past and know each other. But I would like to take a moment to point out that Henry's book is actually extremely accessible, like very, very clearly well written, and I think anyone with no bet, if you've never read a science book before, you could pick up Henry's new book and read it in no time.
Well, thank you very much, Shane. The $20 is in the mail. So this is how agriculture is thought to start.
Okay.
And I started this with an example because I grew up in the countryside and I knew from an early age where the mushrooms were that you would pick and eat and not die, and where the blackberries grew and where the chestnuts were found, and I knew when they could be found. And now I live on the coast, on the English coast, and I know which beaches have oysters and which have razor clams, and which I know where seals live, and so on and so on. So hunters and gatherers don't just randomly hunt and gather. They plan their migrations so that they arrive at certain places when the fruits are in season or when the game is going to be around. So they always have a fairly predictable way of doing things. So
Moses may kind of know when there's going to be a little bit of a drought in that area
they
kind of quote unquote parts the sea.
They tend to have a kind of annual circuit, and agriculture happened in many places more or less at the same time, just at the very end of the last ice age, when hunter-gatherer populations were beginning to increase and hunting and gathering became more and more difficult. So what people tended to do was stay in the same places and commute to where they would hunt and gather. And just like the donkey, they would bring back seeds of things and scatter them along the way. Now, with cereals, what happens is with wheat or barley or most of the crops that that humans depend on, the ears of wheat, the seeds would grow, and eventually they would shatter the pods and spread the seeds around the place. So what the people would want to do was to get the seeds which were almost ripe, which were ripe but hadn't quite shattered, so they could bring the whole thing rather than scraping on the ground and bring that home. And so what they would do, they would select naturally, but without knowledge, of the seeds for the wheat seeds that would grow nice and tall and delay shattering, so they could have them at home, and they'd spread them around, probably inadvertently to start with, near where they lived. So all of a sudden people noticed, oh, goodness me, I don't have to go all that way to have late shattering wheat. It's just growing outside my back door. I wonder why that happened. And so this is how things started. But my favourite domestic animal is the dog. This was the first domestic animal, way before all the other domestic animals. That was domesticated at least 20,000 years ago. But then, people domesticated sheep and goats and cows and various other plants, mostly by selecting for the wild ones that they liked best and inadvertently planting them near where they lived. And then after a few generations, what else would you do? You just farm the stuff that lived near where you lived without remembering that this stuff was once wild.
Right. I
Shane Mauss, lost for words. Just enjoy this moment, people. It doesn't often happen.
Well, I'm thinking about. I now have 10 different directions that I want to go in my mind, and something that I'm stuck on as I'm kind of thinking about the listener. I was just at the Natural History Museum in New York yesterday, and
Oh,
going through
isn't
the.
that a fantastic place?
Oh, amazing!
Yeah.
I've been going like once a week over the last
Mm,
few weeks.
mm,
But I went to the human evolution area and wandered around a bit for some inspiration for this interview.
mm,
Another lucky reason why we got delayed
mm.
because of your power outage. But anyhow, I going back when you talked about humans, I do. I'm I am a little worried that that listeners might be confused because we aren't talking about sapiens, because sapiens are about 300,000 years old. So can we start with can you do a little brief overview of starting at around
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean,
what do you
because
say, 7 million?
the book that the Decline and Fall of the Human Empire, I do go back a bit to review the entirety of human evolution, and what we call the hominins, which is the branch of evolution that leads to humans, as distinct from chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. It started around 7 million years ago-ish. And the problem with trying to work out exactly where it started was back then the ancestors of humans looked pretty much like the ancestors of chimps. So it's hard to tell from a fossil which is which. However, 7 million years ago or thereabouts, hominins appeared, uh, based on an entirely arbitrary characteristic, which is walking upright. Bipedalism, walking on your two legs, that started around 7 million years ago. And there were lots and lots of hominins. Uh,
And
uh,
can I stop you there? Because
yeah.
I hadn't really one of the things, was this your book or another one that I was reading in conjunction or something else I was watching, where there were possibly the ancestors to those hominins were apes that kind of almost were like upright in
Hmm.
trees, almost
That
were
was
kind of
that
a
was
vertical.
that was probably
That was
this
you?
one or my previous
Yeah,
one where I did mention that as well. We're talking about the origin of bipedalism, walking on your
yeah.
hind legs, which is the most really strange and peculiar and maladaptive way of getting around. And nobody really knows how it started, but one idea is that it started in apes that clambered around branches in a kind of upright position. So walking was, or standing upright, was like clambering around in branches, only without the branches. There is a particular ape that lived about 12 million years ago in what is now southern Germany, called Danuvius, which seems to have had that kind of posture. The problem with apes is that they got too big to run along branches, and they didn't have tails that they could swing with or use as counterweights. So they had to adopt a wide variety of ways of getting around. I mean, the orangutan has four hands, basically. The gibbon has these long arms that it uses to swing beneath the branches. Gorillas and chimps can climb, but they tend to live on the ground, and they use their knuckles to walk along with, which is unusual. And humans, among this bizarre, strange range of locomotion, happen to be bipeds. So bipedalism is basically what defines the human lineage as a kind of arbitrary way. And you can see in this hominin called Sahelanthropus chadensis that lived about 7 million years ago in Chad, it looks very chimp-like, but the hole in the skull where the spinal cord goes in underneath the skull rather than at the back, which would happen if you were a quadruped. If your spinal cord happened to go in the base of the skull and you're a quadruped, you'd spend all your time looking at the ground, which would be a bit depressing. When the spinal cord goes in at the base, that's a good sign that it's a biped, even if you haven't got any fossils of limbs. And then there was a range of bipedal ape-like creatures, all early hominins. There were several genera, that is groups of species, Australopithecus, Paranthropus, Ardipithecus. And then about 2.5 million years ago came our own genus, Homo, and these were started as fairly primitive as well. In fact, some of the most primitive ones were probably not much different from Australopithecus. But the big change came around just after 2.5 million years ago. There was a big change in the climate. It got, in Africa, where all this was going on, it got much drier. This was because ice ages were beginning to happen in the northern hemisphere. And as a colleague of mine, Robin Dennell, says, it's an irony that the people most affected by the ice age never knew what snow was or had seen ice, because they were living in the dry savannas of Africa. And it was then that appeared Homo erectus, which was not an omnivorous, scavenging, opportunist creature like all the other ones, but was a specialist hunting carnivore. And it evolved a new kind of gait, which was running. All the other bipedal hominins were not particularly adapted for running. They could walk, but they didn't have the tallness, the long legs, the narrow pelvis, and also the hairlessness, which allows you to run and run and run and run and run in hot weather. It's no accident that all these fantastic long-distance runners that even to this day come from that environment, from the hot, dry landscapes of Kenya and Ethiopia. And if you've been to Kenya and Ethiopia, people are running all the time. That's what they do, because they don't have very good bus services and they have to get to school 3 miles away. So Homo erectus did this. And a great thing about Homo erectus was, and humans as well, is although they can't run very fast in terms of sprinting, they're very good endurance runners. So just like hunting dogs.
Can I stop just for 1 second? I want to get people
excited.
Yeah, do
keep interrupting. Otherwise, I will just keep talking until I die.
I know. It's great. I love it. I have a upcoming guest, another favorite from Here We Are, Herman Poncer. Will be coming on, and he
knows all about this stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm reading his book, available for pre-order now as well, and he had told me about the what's it called, endurance hunting or something, where you basically you get around, you get together with your buddies, and in the middle of the heat of the day you run down some sort of antelope type thing or something that's faster sprinting away than you are. But you jog around, you jog after this thing for 3 or 4 hours, and the way in which quadrupeds breathe and everything else, it makes it so that they can't recuperate in the same way. Eventually the things just fall over.
It just falls down from heat exhaustion, and then you go and hit it on the head with a rock.
I guess in Arizona there's some sort of marathon that you can do against horses.
That's interesting.
You can do like this 25-mile marathon against horses, and people consistently beat horses. In the last couple of years, there's been a couple of humans that have beat every horse.
Yeah, this is an interesting. This idea of long distance running being a part of human evolution was really formalized by a guy in Harvard called Dan Lieberman, and I think Herman Poncer was one of Dan's students. I think, and Dan put this article together in Nature, and I edited that. It's been quite influential, the idea of endurance running, because it explains a lot. It explains a lot of human anatomy, and Homo erectus was the first human to have that kind of anatomy, and it was a very successful hominin. It was the first one that we know about that left Africa and spread all over the world and evolved into a multiplicity of different kinds, from yetis in Tibet to tiny hobbits in Indonesia, and eventually us.
Hey everybody, next week on the show, talking about donkeys. Got some donkey research going. It's International Zebra Day is at the end of the month, right around the corner, as you know. And so I know you've been you're if you're like me and in the concrete jungle right now with cars honking all around you and stuff, maybe you just want to sit back and think about our hooved companion friends for a while.
This is what I wanted to ask you about DNA sequencing. That as it started taking off 25 years ago or whatever. What kind of what were some of the biggest reveals for you as a paleontologist when we
Yeah,
started looking back at DNA?
the first thing was back in the 80s. There was a huge debate in human evolution between whether Homo sapiens came out of Africa. Now, I have to make clear that Homo erectus came out of Africa, but that was 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa from Homo erectus, but came out of Africa much later, between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. And back in the 80s, there was this big debate whether Homo sapiens came out of Africa and essentially replaced all the other hominins, the Neanderthals and other things, and drove them to extinction, so that all modern humans were the same species. So that was called the out of Africa hypothesis. And the other idea was that Homo sapiens evolved in different places from different stocks of Homo erectus and basically interbred and became this kind of intermingled single population called the multi-regional continuity idea. And then in the late 80s, Alan Wilson, who was a pioneering work on DNA, looked at the DNA of 147 modern people. And this was the mitochondrial DNA, so it's a tiny segment of DNA. And they found that of these 147 people, you can look at the mutations in the DNA and make a family tree, and it showed that all humans came out of Africa. All the humans that weren't African were actually quite a small segment of that tree. So the greatest diversity happened in Africa. And I remember reading this paper. It was just before I joined the Submerged Log Company. I was there with Chris Stringer, who's a paleontologist at the Natural History Museum in London.
Why do you call it the Submerged Slug?
I don't know. I don't know why. On my blog, I tend to refer to nature as the Submerged Log Company. I've no idea why. I've been spending 37 years submerging logs, and quite happy. If people would just leave me to get on with it, I'd be quite happy. But I have this unfortunate side hustle where I keep writing books. But anyway, it was just before I joined Nature. I was talking about this paper with Chris Stringer, who's a paleontologist at the Natural History Museum in London, and we just happened to be on the London Underground together. I can't remember why. Maybe we'd been to coming back from a conference or something. And we were talking about how this supported his views rather than the multi-regional continuity. However, since then, people have sequenced more DNA, not just the mitochondria, but the nuclear DNA, the DNA in the nucleus. Since then, since then, people have sequenced the whole human genome dozens of times. And now people can sequence the genomes of extinct people, Neanderthals, and these curious creatures called Denisovans from Eastern Asia, who were cousins of Neanderthals. And people know more about the genomes of these things than they do about the actual fossils, because they can sequence the DNA from tiny nondescript pieces of bone. And what people found, this started with Svante Pääbo in Leipzig, who got a Nobel a year or so ago for his work on ancient DNA. Svante is a very interesting character. When he was young, he didn't know whether to be an Egyptologist or a biochemist. Egyptology, biochemistry. So he finessed it and decided to sequence the DNA of an Egyptian mummy, and a new science was born. Anyway, since we have all this new information, we now know that when modern humans left Africa, they interbred with a lot of the other hominins that were still there. Everyone on Earth who doesn't have an exclusively African ancestry, has about 2% DNA that comes from Neanderthals. And there are a lot of people in Eastern and Southeastern Asia that also have 2 to 4% Denisovan DNA. And there are bits of DNA in modern Africans that come from other species that we know nothing else about. The only thing we know about them is that they left their DNA in modern humans. It's a bit like Alice's Cheshire cat disappearing, all except for its smile. So we know that modern humans interbred with a lot of other things. And we now know this. We actually have evidence for this. There was a piece of bone in Romania that was sequenced, and it found that it was a modern human, an early modern human from about 45,000 years ago, which was when modern humans first came into Europe to displace the Neanderthals. But they made love, not war, because it turned out that this person had a Neanderthal great-grandparent. You can just see that. That was just so close to that hybridization event. It makes it almost personal. There are some, we would have had more Neanderthal DNA than we would have, except that quite a lot of Neanderthal DNA was quite deleterious for some reason, and was edited out by selection, because the people with that DNA maybe didn't survive to adulthood as much as the other ones. But there are certain, I think there's a bit of Neanderthal DNA that determines whether you are or are not, I can't remember which, whether you are or are not hospitalized with COVID-19. There's a bit of the Denisovans were the original Yetis. They evolved in Tibet, on the Tibetan plateau. And one of the reasons we know this, apart from the fossils, is that there is a bit of Denisovan DNA that allows modern Tibetans to breathe easily in the roof of the world, in very, very low oxygen conditions. So modern humans originated in Africa, sure, but when they started, they were kind of a raw ingredient and had to be seasoned by contributions from other hominins. So yes, all modern humans originated in Africa, but they were kind of salted on the way by little bits of other things, some of which we know nothing about, which I think is really fascinating.
Absolutely. I've recently discovered a tool even better than genetic sequencing. I have a time machine that you're going to get to use for the rest of the year, but your limitation is going to break your heart. You can only go back to study human history, just to examine aspects of your book that you are less clear on. What would you use a time machine to go back to, like, clear up, to kind of what things do you think that you would like more evidence for in the future?
Well, we haven't touched on a lot of the book, especially some of the more modern things about why humans are becoming extinct. But one of the reasons that humans are quite vulnerable is humans do get a lot of diseases. And there's a guy who you should talk to, you may well have done already, called Kyle Harper, who did a book a few years ago, called about the history of disease. It was called, well, I mentioned it in my book. He's at the University of Oklahoma. He's a historian of disease. His book was fascinating. It came out about the same time as my last book. And so I read his book, and I mention it quite a lot in my new book. But it turns out there are quite a few diseases in history that nobody knows anything about, because they were very virulent, and they came and went quite quickly. And one of them that affected Tudor England was called the English sweating sickness.
Oh my God! This was one of the more horrifying
It was
things
this
that I
it was
found
this
myself contemplating.
yeah, it was this disease that happened in England at the same time as the end of the War of the Roses, about 1485, when King Henry the Seventh deposed Richard III, and there was a scourge of English sweating sickness, and it repeated several times. There were waves of it, and it was last recorded sometime in the early 1600, late 1500s. That was the last occurrence, and nobody knows anything about it or what kind of disease it was, except that it was really, it killed within a day. It affected, well, according to Hilary Mantel in her fabulous book Wolf Hall, it affected Thomas Cromwell, the senior advisor to Henry VIII. He went away on some diplomatic mission, and he came back, and all his wife and family had died from English sweating sickness. He was only away for a couple of days, and when he got home, they died. And so so there are all these kinds of diseases in history that have changed history, but we know nothing about, and that's kind of worrying in a sense, because all these lots of new diseases keep cropping up. I mean, we've had COVID-19, which was a entirely new thing that came out of bats or pangolins or both in China, but there are just in the 20th century, Zika, Ebola, West Nile virus, chikungunya, and another one I can't remember. These are just the ones I can think of in the Legionnaire's disease. These are just diseases that have cropped up in the 20th century, and cause a lot of problems. And so there are all these diseases that come and go. And I'd like to go back to Tudor England with a suitable Class 4 hazmat suit and find out what caused English sweating sickness. It was one of the great diseases of early modern England.
Just horrifying. Because I mean, generally, when something is that that virile, it doesn't. I mean, usually if something kills its host that fast, it's not going to spread quite as
well. What
quite as
happens
readily.
with what happens with new diseases is they tend to be quite virulent.
Yeah.
And if they keep on being virulent, they'll just burn themselves out for the reason you state. They'll just kill all the hosts. And after a while, we become naturalized to them. So if you'll remember when COVID started, it did kill
much
people.
More severe in the early strains.
It actually killed people. It killed people that I knew. And it's about... it's killed 1 in 1,000 people in the world, which is... not as big as the Justinian plague or the Black Death or something, but it's still a biggie. But now COVID is just meh. It's just it makes you feel rotten for a few days, and then that's fine, because it's evolved. The strains have evolved, and they've naturalized, because viruses evolve just like people. The viruses that succeed enough to spread between people but don't kill people. They make people feel a bit... They also work so they spread before you become symptomatic, so that you're happily going around partying and coughing and sneezing over all your friends and relations, and it's only then that you feel a bit shit and have to go to bed. And
even better for you if you happen to make your host Randy or more social.
Yeah, indeed. So the virus makes you want to go out and party and go to the pub and breathe over.
It's such a horrifying,
this does happen in nature. I mean, there are, you've probably heard about the parasite of ants. That makes ants go to the top of grasses so that they're eaten by cows and then can fulfill their life cycle.
Isn't there what's the one with the mushrooms sprouting from the head or whatever?
There is that sort of thing as well.
And I guess that I found out, like I knew about that. I'd seen that some mushroom or something takes over the some ant or something that climbs up a tree and then it fruits on the tree, killing the ant. But I guess it's not affecting its brain. I didn't look into this well enough,
There
but
are things that there are things with ants that turn them into crazy ants, and they go and change their behaviour, all
right.
for spreading the disease.
This
I
I
can't
think
remember what.
I think this hijacks a different part of their nervous system so
Mm.
that they lose control of their body, but
Mm.
they're
Yeah.
still like the rest of their was
Mm.
there. They just like they have no choice but to keep on climbing up this tree. I mean, it is even though it's obviously the trend that that a virus is going to the viruses that are less virulent are going to kind of be selected for over time if they keep their hosts around. That's not some agreement that we have with with the viruses
Well, well,
necessarily.
but think about.
And
Mm, mm.
if a virus is lucky enough to get to hosts, it's in its own interest to be as virulent
Mm. Well, the
as
thing
possible.
is, with humans are extraordinarily prone to disease, and this is partly to do with our limited genetic heritage. And also because of agriculture, when we started rootling around in soil, which are full of worms and not just earthworms, and also when we started living very close to our domestic animals. Now, when we were
Yeah.
hunter-gatherers, the closest we'd get to an animal was we'd kill it and then eat it, and then that would be that. But now people live in the same houses as their chickens and their pigs until quite recently, and so things like flu are, avian flu is a big problem, and influenza comes from poultry originally,
Right.
and tuberculosis comes from cattle. And so we had an additional number of diseases, and in America, avian flu is spreading through cows and is spreading through milk that's unpasteurized, through unpasteurized milk. People are saying, I've seen this online on Blue Sky, which is the now new
It's
trendy version of Twitter, is people saying, "Oh no, I'm getting avian flu from raw milk," and somebody says, "Oh no, if only there was a way to treat milk so that you wouldn't get this." I said, "There is, but it's just went pasteurized." So,
uh,
there we are. So we're still getting these
oh my
diseases from
God.
livestock. And of course, the more humans there are, the more humans disturb the few remaining patches of undisturbed wildlife and stir up all the diseases. So
Well,
HIV. That,
by shrinking
mm, mm,
the wildlife space, you're also forcing other species. You're
yes.
not just increasing zoonosis between
Well,
humans and pigs and birds.
well,
You're increasing them between one another
well. There's
because
a
they're shorter.
humans, bats.
Right.
Not very, very close. Or I could tell you a story about me and a bat once. It is quite. It's perfectly suitable for family viewing, though. That bats host a huge number of coronaviruses.
Yeah.
And they seem to have an incredible load of coronaviruses and have no symptoms at all. And so it's quite likely that COVID-19 came from a bat. But I
Yeah.
remember growing up in the country, we talked about growing up in the country and I used to go and forage. Well, we lived in this house in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the woods. And when me and my sister were teenagers and I could drive, my parents would just vanish off to France for a month and leave us to get on with it in this big old house. Well, I remember me and my sister watched late at night. We watched this horror double bill. It was Boris Karloff. It was The Black Cat, followed by The Raven. all creaky Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. And so after this, we switched off and we walked upstairs, creaking up this 17th century cottage staircase to our rooms with the low beams. And I was just about getting ready for bed in my room where my sister shrieks, "Henry, help, there's a bat in my room." So she chases it out, and I chase it out into the bathroom, and I shut the door, and then there's me and this bat chasing each other round and round the room. Eventually the bat just dies, or doesn't die, it just suffers from exhaustion on the mantel shelf going. It was this cute little long-eared bat, so I picked it up and threw it out the window, and I thought this could only have happened after we just watched The Black Cat and The Raven. I mean, what a perfect end to an evening of classic horror films. But anyway, animals that we come into... Chimpanzees host what was originally HIV-1, the precursor of AIDS, and probably spread to humans through bushmeat, which is in some countries. You can buy meat which is just called meat. You don't know where it comes from. I remember when I was an undergraduate in Leeds University going to very cheap curry houses, and you could have meat curry. You didn't know what sort of meat it was until one day I was walking along the street past one of these curry houses, and the door flew open, and there was this guy chasing a rat down the street. So I thought, yeah, well, I may not go to that particular, I may not dine at that particular establishment again.
Right. So, all right. So, there's obviously we've really only even touched on part one and haven't even of your 3-part book. How about this? I have a deal for you. This has been enticing enough, I feel, to get people to pre-order your book. How about once people have had a chance to order your book, and I'll have them ask questions on Discord. You come back on after the book
I'd be really happy to do that. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah,
we've done, we did your previous long-running podcast.
Yeah.
What has made you do it again? Are you keeping the old one on, or is this a complete rebrand? What's the whole idea?
Well, I'm trying out a rebrand. So here's what happened. Before I met you, I used to go to all of my guests in person. Before COVID, I went to all of my guests in person. It started like I would be touring around, and I would look up a university, and I'd be like, I'm in Miami.
I remember that, yeah.
And I'd set up my audio equipment, right? I'd bring in a couple microphones and a recorder, fairly straightforward setup. I would only make it a little more elaborate so that guests thought I knew what I was doing. And then COVID happened, and then I'm suddenly talking to people like yourself remotely, and then lo and behold, we got this video. Might as well record that. Might as well put it out in a video podcast. It's the age of Instagram and TikTok and all of these things. You need to create video clips. So then once I started touring again, after I was like, well, how am I gonna see? Most podcasters have a studio where the guests are coming to you. It's all set up, but has the 8-camera shoot. There's a whole, and so how am I going to replicate this on the road? And I had a lot of different iterations. I even thought I was going to do a docu-series for a little while. And then meanwhile, I'm on the busiest tour of my life.
Yeah, you've been around. You've been very busy.
And missing talking with scientists so much. And so I was going to bring back Here We Are. And then I thought, well, I'm also interacting with all these artists. Maybe I don't want it to be as limited. And then enough time went by that I was like, you know what? I actually want to even limit the scope. You know what I miss when I'm having a bad day? I miss just like thinking about nature specifically and animals and evolution. And it helps me. Yeah, like I said, reading a book like yours that's about the extinction of my the potential future extinction of my species, is more relaxing to me than half the emails that I have to attend to. And so I thought that I would maybe try narrowing the focus a little bit and see if I could maybe see what would jostle loose if I rebrand a little bit. So here we are, as always. There, I could always bring it back, and this conversation is indecipherable from a here we are episode. But I might incorporate some solo episodes and do a few things like that.
Did you have much time?
To rebrand.
I mean, in your last tour, did you have much time to do Here We Are much? I mean, because
I had no.
You were really on the road.
All.
You were all over the place.
I was in 3 cities a week. Not only that, but I had my show was a whole like visual experience with a video jockey providing like real-time visuals for it, and he did it all remotely because he couldn't tour with me. And so I had to set up everything. Every venue, every city that I went to had a whole, it was I'd have to drive 3 hours to a new city, get there 4 hours early to spend 2 hours setting everything up, make sure everything's good to go, set up merch, doors open. I have an hour break, 2-hour show, meet and greet afterwards for an hour, and go sleep and do it all over again. So yeah, so now that I'm not doing that, I've been very excited to talk with scientists again. I will say that it was a little bit nice to have a break, and at the same time, I feel very rusty. I feel like my science brain is knocking some rust off, but it's fun to get back into.
On the other hand, these influences work both ways, because I've started treating COVID. I've been kind of marooned in my secret underground villain's lair underneath an extinct volcano in an undisclosed location where I'm now talking to you from. But since COVID,
even in your lair, it sounds like you're trapped in a very specific
it's
room.
because all villains are actually
if only we could lock all villains in from the outside.
All omnipotent villains have even more omnipotent wives who very obligingly shut them in, so the noise of the washing machine and the dogs and things don't intrude. But since COVID, I've been getting out a bit, and I've been doing more talking about books, and I now do it as stand-up. That's how I do it.
Wait, you do stand-up comedy?
No. It's basically after talking to you and after having been to see some stand-up locally, I thought it's always been my. It's not like it's been some instant transition. It's because I got very fed up quite early on of presentations by scientists that have slides and PowerPoint, and they're talking to their slides, and if you're going to do this for 40 minutes or an hour, this will make people very bored. So for some years, when I've been out on the stump for the Submerged Log Company talking about my job, I have no slides at all, and this partly comes from two things. One is the guy who hired me at Nature, who's don't look for him, he's dead now, John Maddox, who was a fantastic extempore talker. He would have no audio-visual aids at all. He'd just stand up and talk. And also, at the time when I was a graduate student and starting to give presentations, we were just moving from old-fashioned Kodachrome slides to early digital things, and you may remember this. It was a shit show. They would always break down, nothing would work, there were all these compatibility issues with different formats. So now what I thought is, I'm not going to have that. I'm only going to have a few minutes to talk, and I can't have anything breaking down. So I have no AV most of the time. Sometimes I do, but mostly I just stand up and talk, and most of the time it's a Q&A. So I just say who I am, any questions. And because, when I'm talking to scientists, most people want to know, why did I reject your manuscript, or how do you choose referees? There's so many things they want to know especially when I'm talking to students, that you can fill an hour, no problem, with Q&A.
Yeah.
And as you know, because you've talked to me a few times, there are very few embarrassing pauses in the conversation. I'll just keep going. So now when I talk about my book, I just have a roaming mic, and sometimes I just talk to the audience. Sometimes I move around the audience, and it's more like a stand-up. So there is a
I
kind of
love
cross
that.
fertile,
Yeah.
and it always
You know,
goes really well.
well, I did before COVID. I was doing a show. This is before you and I met. I did a show, Stand Up Science, where
Yeah, I
I
remember.
would
Yeah, yeah,
tour around and I would have local professors on, and I'm changing the format of it because I would have like I would do comedy and then I'd have someone give a talk and I'd do comedy and and I'm changing the format, so instead I'm not leaving the stage. I'm interviewing guests because one. Scientists always go over their damn time,
yeah.
and I have a venues mad at me, and two, it was too unpredictable, but it was fun to watch the public speaking mistakes that I can't recall all of them off of the top of my head, but here's one that drives me crazy. Is like I'm not opposed to slides. I've even thought about putting in like more visuals in my act since doing this tour where I had a VJ, doing art that went along with it. I've seen the appeal of it, but what drives me crazy is when someone says something, but they put on the screen what they're saying. It's
Yeah.
like either put the quote on the screen or say the quote, but you don't put both. I don't want to listen and I don't want to read what you're reading to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It drives me insane.
Yeah, this is
And
exactly. I know. I think basically that speaks of someone who hasn't prepared enough. They're basically
yeah.
lecturing from their preparatory notes, and it's like going. It's like being in a play and going on holding the script. And
Well,
it's. I completely. I completely
the,
agree.
this is the other thing too. It's very it's normal for I go I have someone who studies hyenas or something. Actually, I had a
Mm.
fantastic guest who studied hyenas, but just as a random example, sometimes someone would be like so nervous and they would want to read off of a script. They'd be like they'd be so scared they're going to screw something up.
Mm.
And it's like, I promise you,
Mm.
you could, in your sleep, way more about hyenas than anyone else in this room. Like,
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
you will be just fine. No
Mm.
one's, I think maybe scientists are so used to having to lecture to their peers.
Mm. Mm.
And,
Mm.
and then afterwards, the actually, guys are raising
Yeah,
their
yes,
hands
yes. This is
and correcting them.
more of a comment than a question. Yeah, that's
Y-
that's what they say. It's a death. No, it could be, but you see, not all scientists are natural speakers, and
Right, right.
not so. Um, some people are better at it than others. I mean, my professor, I talked about in my book, my professor Neil Alexander at the University of Leeds, who was a bit like Gandalf. He gave fantastic lectures. They were beautiful, and I remember
Yeah,
having chats with him at the time, talking about the whole theme of lectures as theatre, as performance, because these
yeah.
were the things that stick with you, and that. I mean, I remember I had another, when I was an undergraduate, another lecturer who was a parasitologist. He gave a whole lecture about worms. In fact, it was a whole series of lectures about worms. But this guy knew his stuff, and he was so passionate about it that I thought, I love this guy. If I
Yeah.
don't be a paleontologist, I am going to study worms. You have got me.
Right, right.
So it's obviously somebody
He had a
who
parasitic effect on you.
really put over, and he did it in a very beautiful way, in a very simple way, and it was very well organised. But he'd obviously done it a lot, and he knew what to do. And he was, even though he was still enthusiastic about it. So, how do you do it when you started a tour in LA and 247 days later you're in Osmosis, Nebraska? I mean, how do you keep the enthusiasm up when you've done this tour and you're doing similar material?
It comes and goes in
Mm,
waves. I usually start deviating quite a bit from what the original, like once I have everything locked into, like, okay, this is what the recorded special is going to be,
mm,
and now I'm setting a date to record it. And then I start experimenting with what the next show, like I have a new 2 hour show
yeah.
that's ready. So by the time that I finished recording this 2 hours that I just did, that I'm finishing editing right now, I then had gigs booked for weeks after that I already had the
Mm,
next 2 hours.
mm,
I
mm,
hadn't performed in that way, and it was like a hair rough in the first
yeah.
couple. It was actually sort of fun in its looseness, but I kind of had that ready to go because I was already trying out some of that
Mm,
stuff
mm,
through the other tour. But yeah, I mean, I think that also it's just there's endless ways to experiment, and
mm, mm,
this is my first time doing it was really like a two-person performance, and
mm,
so it
mm, mm.
was I was interacting with the visuals and vice versa,
Oh, yeah.
and so it was a little bit different every night, and also there was so many technical things that could go askew that I was so nervous about the technical issues that being able to just not even think about my material was it was actually the show was so intense
Mm, mm.
outside of the stage that it's funny, people scared of public speaking. The only time I was relaxed on the for the last 2 years was that 2 hours a night that I got to be on stage delivering my material. That was the only time that I ever got to
Well, because of all
relax.
the minutiae of the preparation and all the technical
Yeah,
stuff.
figuring
Yeah.
it out, marketing
Mm,
issues,
mm,
and everything else, and then
mm,
even when things are going swimmingly well, then you're like, okay, I guess we need to do bigger venues,
mm,
and then that needs to change how we scale the marketing,
mm.
and just endless puzzles. So yeah, the getting on stage part was. And it was also, a lot of it was material that I tried to get recorded back in like 2017, but the
Mm.
world wasn't ready at that
No,
time. It was
no,
too
the
much of a
world was
taboo.
definitely not ready in 2017.
and
Gosh, it seems like a
it,
100 years ago now, doesn't it? Ah,
it sure does. And during COVID, the priorities have shifted a bit,
mm, mm.
and people aren't so as prone to the some of the fear mongering around some of the psychedelics that I've
Well,
had a show
I have
talking
to
about.
say,
So
Shane,
yeah.
what with things happening in the US and A at the moment, I wish you a very great success promoting science in any which way you can.
Oh, I mean, this is the scariest possible thing that I could do, to promote actual science,
Mm, mm.
not conspiracies, and
Oh,
not the
yeah.
far out sci-fi,
Mm,
this and that. Yeah, it's I think I my I think that people will perhaps just get exhausted
mm,
by the amount of stimulation of needing everything to be like, if I'm not watching someone do a triple backflip into a tank of sharks on Instagram, I
mm,
need to be watching the most horrific news that's happening at this very moment
mm,
globally.
mm.
I think maybe people's nervous system will eventually just go, "Whoa, we
Well,
need to."
I think you're right because I do wonder about I mean, social media is addictive, right?
It sure is.
I remember my daughter going through her high school, and she and her girlfriends were perpetually increasing each other's anxiety because they were always talking about their lives and their assignments and
Yeah.
homework, and it just made them into really anxious people, which took a while to wear off. And
Yeah.
sometimes, my wife has now switched off her Facebook account. We only use it for Messenger. I'm only on a lot of things really for the book. I mean, I would,
Right.
I'm now mostly on Blue Sky, which is a bit like what Twitter used to be before it went bad.
Yeah.
But I've still got accounts on Twitter and Instagram and so on, because sometimes it's the only way I can get in touch with old friends. But sometimes I think it wasn't so bad back in the day when the only way you could get news was on the radio at 9 p.m. very in the evening, when everyone would sit around the radiogram. This is the news, and this is Alvar Liddell reading it. There has been,
Yeah.
in the desert, an eighth army push has bottled up the Germans, and that the only way of getting the news was the Times 3 days late,
Yeah.
and it wasn't such a long time ago, because I remember I was working at the Submerged Log Company, but I took a sabbatical in 1996, and I taught at UCLA for the winter quarter of 1996. And I lived in a little apartment in Westwood, and I taught a graduate seminar course, and I did a bit of research. But the only way I could get Nature was by mail, and it was 2 weeks late. This was before the internet. This was 1996. It was before the internet. The only way I could get Nature was by mail, 2 weeks late. And did I suffer greatly? No. I had a lovely time. I spent more time interacting with actual real people, especially as there was a federal strike, and I had to go to the federal building on the small times it was open just to get a social security number. Otherwise I wouldn't be paid or be able to pay my rent. So there were other things to worry about then, and it wasn't burning down at the time, which was so we had a lot of things in those days that we didn't have now, like the federal building and trees. I don't think it was that bad. You see, I worry, could I give up my social media accounts? But then I think, yeah, for most, of course I could.
Yeah.
I've
thought of this the other day when my special comes out. I was thinking about deleting all of my social media, depending, because it's like that's also that's a different niche. It's like Bo Burnham, one of the most genius comedians today. He's not sitting around posting 5 times a day on social media, and it is. I rarely post, but it's like by the time you figure out, like stand-ups, for example, had this moment where everyone can just do these crowd work clips and satiate this consumer demand for new material while not burning the material that they're working on for a special, and then whoever has the best crowd work clips is filling the most seats. And now it's like, well, if you're 5 years behind that trend, and now if I do want to go out and film myself doing crowd work, which I don't want to do, but like, okay, this is the way that we sell things. Well, you find out that's the way you sold things 5 years ago, and you're a late adopter anyway. So it seems, I don't know. It's really interesting that, and maybe we'll be talking about this next time, of humans threatened by their own acquisition of abundance. So in the same way of the being able to have food that is what did you say, one meal away from starving, two meals away from extinction.
Yeah.
And suddenly you have we're able to get such calories packed so densely, so easily, so cheaply, and
yes.
so deliciously,
yes,
that we have a modern problem we never had before, and the evolution of information seems to be hitting.
But both of them are the same thing. So there's too much choice. It does your brain in. I mean, here's another example. When I went to live in LA, I needed, I'd moved into my apartment, then I had to go to the grocery store. So I did the one solecism that you never do in LA. You walk to the grocery store. So already people are looking at, because I couldn't rent a car. I didn't have a social security number. I didn't have any money. So
Yeah,
so
you don't do. Why would you do that? It would take you half the time. You don't
yeah,
get
yeah.
to enjoy the whole trip if you don't get in
It
your
was
car.
actually quite dangerous because there's no sidewalks occasionally. But
Right.
they look at you like you're funny or dangerous. So I just wanted to buy a carton of milk. I just want to go and get some milk, but you could have milk. It's got high fat, low fat, medium fat, with cream, without cream, with calcium, with vitamin D, without calcium, without vitamin D, with vitamin D, but without calcium. And then there's soya milk, and that comes with calcium or turpentine or iron filings. And, I was in danger of actually leaving the store without buying anything. I just want to buy some milk, a carton with a cow on it that says milk. That's all I wanted to
Yeah.
do. So this, there is such a thing as too much choice. Have you heard of a guy called Gerd Gergerenzer?
No,
Great
but
name.
that's one of my favorite new names.
Gerd Gergerenzer. He wrote a book called Gut Feeling. He's basically a psychologist who deals with marketing, and he talks about too much choice. And he talked about the success of a restaurant. This restaurant only did one meal. I don't know what it was, burgers and fries, bouillabaisse, it could have been anything. And it only did this one meal. That was it. This was on the menu. That's what you got. You didn't get anything else. And it was an absolute hit because people knew what they were going to get. They knew it was good. They knew exactly what it was. And it was no stress. I'll come in and I'll have a plate of that. Great. Lovely. And no vegetarian options, no desserts, nothing. That was just, you got a bowl of whatever it was. And you go into any mom and pop restaurant in France and you have whatever whatever mom's making round the back. It's just makes life so much easier.
Well, yeah, I mean, but then this is part of the trouble too, where now people have this this well-intentioned paleo fantasy of like, instead of all these milk choices, let's go back to raw milk.
Yeah,
without
well,
knowing that,
there is pasteurization for a reason. Well, I'd only want a carton of milk, but I did expect it to be pasteurized. I mean, I do have some standards. So there's that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that I think this is part of why this was going to be. I'm only talking about non-human animals. That was an original idea for this show, and then I decided, well, I think one of the most important things to me is understanding kind of cognitive biases and logical fallacies, because people will need to start to learn tools for deciphering information and training some of those skills in a way to decipher headlines and and how to make their way through the tsunami of digital stimulation and information that are being slammed with on a daily basis.
I actually gave up social media for Lent last year. I just and I don't know. I know I gave up news. I didn't look at news at all for 50
I think
days.
that will be a part of my church, which I will start as because I'm realizing with the Feast of the Ass and trying to bring that back, I'll need to have some sort of a church. I think that will be some sort of ritual where you lock your phones away for some period of some equivalent of a Sabbath or something like that. Where
did you ever read Neil Stephenson's book Anathem?
No, I don't. I'm not the. I am not the reader you are, Henry. Please don't put that on me.
Basically, it's about this. It's basically there's this kind of monastery in a world which is basically full of science, but there are orders of monks. They're day monks, week monks, month monks, and basically you go in for a time, and you can only work with the science that you had current on the day you went in. So if and there are people who are there for a day, people there for a year. Sometimes there are people there for 1,000 years or 10,000 years, and you cannot be exposed to the outside world for that period. So that's a kind of extreme digital detox, and it goes into all the various things that might happen. Really good.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I write mostly on the computer, but I have this notebook here that I'm taking some notes on, and it's different parts of the brain that when I sit and I put the pen to pad, it lights up different aspects of my mind. However much placebo effect that is doesn't matter to me. I just feel different. I feel better and more creative, but I don't get to store anything, and I'm never going to look back at these scribbles, and so it will be greater treasures, but more lost treasures.
Oh yeah. It'll be like it'll be like the Dark Ages all over again. I mean, so because everything's digital and it won't be translatable, yeah.
Well,
anyway.
I mean, this is to me one of the in the next episode when we think back to 10,000 years from now, say, and the humans go extinct. I do love the idea of 200,000 years from now. Some species that did figure out the interstellar travel that you propose as a way of saving a species like ours, and then they come across what's so interesting is like we have to go back and we can use DNA, we can find these fossil records and everything, but we might. There might be in a bunker somewhere these hard drives with all of this information that has all of these. They'll look at a David Attenborough documentary and they'll think, oh, what got him? Was it these snakes chasing the things around? And then and then they'll get to the
No, it wasn't. It was the
reality television shows.
Oh, it was the purple lizards in Florida. That's what got them.
And then they'll realize it was the show The Apprentice.
Then realize it was the Kardashians that drove them to extinction. Yeah.
So.
Oh yes, The Apprentice. God. Yeah.
So, Henry, I absolutely adore talking to you.
It's great fun. Likewise.
This is wonderful to have you back. Wonderful to be back. Thanks for helping me kick off my new show, InShanely Curious. I'm InShanely curious about having you back on and exploring so many more topics. So let's talk more once the book comes out and my listeners have had a chance to read it. Because that makes them have to. They have to do it now. They have to read it. They have to do the homework, and then they get.
I'll tell you next time about my new best friend Eric Idle. That was quite something. Yeah, I'll tell you about that later. That was something. Right. Okay,
fantastic.
That's the show, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me as we're building this together. Experimenting, is recording intros and outros while walking around a city packed with traffic and people a good idea for listeners? I don't know. How do you know unless you try? Check out Henry G's books. Again, pre-order his latest, The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire. Today. It's fantastic. I was lucky enough to get a chance to read it already, and check out. He has a zillion books. The only other one that I've read is one of my favorite books of all time. And when you read as few books as I do, they do really stick with you. So I might be a bit biased, but the very short history of life on Earth, 4.6 billion years. Life in 12 pithy chapters, and you can read that right away. And I know with all of this Feast of the Ass talk, you guys are hungry for donkey information. Shane, quit teasing us. When are we going to get to learn about donkeys? You're obviously saying to yourself right now, pulling your hair out at work and this is causing all sorts, no doubt, all sorts of grief in your life. but I would recommend to take some lessons from our donkey companions and display a little bit of stoicism and patience, because it's right around the corner. Next week, I will be talking with Sarah King all about donkeys and equines more generally. She studies behavior and ecology of donkeys and horses, and she studies a lot of the impacts that they have on our current environment. What happens when humans domesticate donkeys for so long, and then suddenly we have cars and tractors and such, and you no longer have the same need for donkeys that humans once had, and now they're roaming free again. Really interesting. She was able to really indulge me in my new fascination with ungulate evolution. How the heck species got hooves in the first place? Imagine having a hoof instead of those toesies of yours. Imagine it was all just one thing. It's just like a toenail you're standing around. How the heck does something like that evolve in the first place? Have some peculiar implications on digestion? Possibly. Really strange. This is one of those, when you're insanely curious, you have no idea the kind of rabbit holes that you're going to start going down once you look into some subject, and everything is, of course, so much more interesting and detailed and complex than you can ever imagine when you first start looking into it. And so I'm looking forward to you hearing that. She also has, in addition to her work at USC or CSU, Colorado State University. She also does animal training and uses her knowledge of animal behavior to help people have better relationships with their dogs, horses, other domesticated pets with Brennan Behavior. So you can check that out. And again, if you're interested in My Purple Lady, I recommend slapping in offer code FOSSILS to save money on shipping. Go to mypurplelady.com, and most importantly, subscribe to this show so you don't miss out on future episodes as we launch this thing together. Thank you so much for joining me.